Sin, the way Christianity presents it, is useless at stopping evil or controlling amoral and antisocial behavior. But then that isn't what sin is for. Sin and the concept of sin have a far more sinister purpose, which has nothing to do with keeping bad people in line and everything to do with making sure that good people are kept under the thumb of the religious rulers who wield authority. Sin is the worst kind of gaslighting, straight out of the Narcissist's playbook. And if you don't believe me, stick around and I'll explain. This is the Atheism for Beginners channel and I'm your host, Christian Exenberg. According to Christian tradition, God decides what is and what is not sin. He made up the rules and passed them on to his representatives throughout the course of the Bible. He can change what he considers to be sin and what he doesn't, how bad a particular sin is, and the appropriate punishment whenever he wants. It's entirely up to him. Throughout the Bible, he changes the list quite often, mostly just adding new rules, but given that there's a major review between the Old and New Testaments, changing the rules has a clear precedent. He could give amnesty to sinners and let them off the hook, or mete out useful and educational punishments that provide a motivation to improve behavior. But to reiterate my point, it's entirely up to God. The rules, leniency, forgiveness, punishment, all of it. God is not only the judge, jury, and executioner, but also the legislator making up the rules in the first place. Somewhere between Genesis and Matthew, God decided that he needs to give his people a means to redeem themselves and earn his forgiveness for breaking the rules. What a fantastic plan. Everybody makes mistakes now and again, so forgiveness is a good thing. Throwing away each soul for each transgression does seem wasteful, especially if you are trying to build a people, gather souls, or achieve whatever God is trying to achieve. So what does he do? Does he set up a community service scheme where sinners can go and do penance while doing good for the community? That would serve as a motivator not to sin again and help build the community. Or does he find some other way to punish them so that they learn their lesson? No. Does he just let them off the hook? Yes, that's exactly what he does. He lets anyone get forgiveness just by asking for it. But then God decides that that's just too easy. Some price needs to be paid for the sins. He can't just let them go. He needs his pound of flesh. He can do that. He's the arbiter of these things after all. Not to mention the creator of the universe. So he's well within his rights here. And I'm still happy to accept the logic up to this point. The next part is where I run into trouble though. Because it makes no sense if you consider it from the perspective of a God. And don't tell me I'm too stupid to understand God's mind. That's just the cop-out to avoid the question. I know under what circumstances all of this makes sense. And we'll get to that soon enough. But let's get back to the story. So God has an idea. Why don't we just punish one person for all the sins of all mankind forever? Then anyone can be forgiven simply by asking for forgiveness. Brilliant. That way, God can have his pound of flesh, and mankind can sin as they please, just so long as the last thing they do in their lives is to ask for forgiveness, right? So instead of just letting go of the sin and forgiving, which he could do if he wanted, God decided that somebody must be murdered in exchange for our sins. Some innocent person who has nothing whatsoever to do with our sins has to pay the price for everybody. But what life would be worth all that forgiveness? The sum of all our sins amounts to a really big pound of flesh after all. It would have to be a god, or at least a half god, half human. But the only place a monotheistic god could get another god to kill would be to produce one himself. And that's exactly what God does. I won't go into the rest of that story because I think most of us know it well enough. But let me just point out the absurdity of the concept here, if you take it from God's point of view. We know that God decides what is and what is not sin. So everything that follows is at God's discretion. God decides he wants to punish sinners, which he doesn't need to do. But instead of punishing the individual sinners, he decides to rather punish a scapegoat, which he doesn't need to do. The only worthy scapegoat is the son he must first produce so that he can have a God to punish. A son who may or may not be God himself, depending on which way around you want to look at the doctrine. So God effectively punishes himself, or worse, his child, for our sins, which he doesn't need to do if he doesn't want to. Also that he can give mankind a free pass, which he could have done if he had wanted without getting into all of the nasty procreation and crucifixion stuff. I know that every preacher is going to tell you that God sacrificed his son because his love for his people was so great. But the reality is that this was all his own doing. He didn't need to sacrifice anything. The insistence that a scapegoat was necessary was his own choice. God could have just let it go. Honestly, why bother with the entire concept in the first place? Why not just let mankind worry about handling their own miscreants and stop trying to manage it at the celestial level? He could decide who was and who wasn't worthy on merit. Let people learn their own lessons and not bother with all this forgiveness and divine sacrifice nonsense. It makes no sense from that perspective. And yeah, I know the standard comeback. It's that we are too stupid to know the mind of God. But as I said, that's just a cop-out to avoid awkward questions that the purveyors of religion can't answer, because none of this stuff makes any sense at all. And I might even have fallen for the cop-out, except that there's a perspective from which this all makes perfect sense. Now imagine it's 2000-ish years ago, and that you and your buddies want to break away from the Jewish faith and start your own religion, because you've figured out where the source of power lies. But you have a problem. You need to convince a lot more people to follow you if you're going to make this work. But you know that they all believe in God. And you know that they're not going to stop believing in their old God to follow you and your new God, because it's too deeply ingrained in them. They've been indoctrinated their entire lives. They're also not going to believe in a different God, because that goes against everything they believe as well. It's literally the first commandment. You also can't just use the old God, because then you wouldn't be breaking away now, would you? So you need a new God, who is not the old God, but is also not a different God. And you need people to believe that they are totally indebted to the new God, so that they will have a reason to worship him. Whammo, Jesus. Son of the old God, and one with the old God, but not the same God as the old God. Jesus fits the breakaway God requirement perfectly. But we still need a reason why the people owe the new God. A reason that will make them come to church on Sundays and do as they're told. We owe the old God because he created us and everything that we have in this world, and because he will smite us if we disobey. But why do we owe the new God? I think we all know the answer to that question already. It's because he died for our sins. Well, he didn't really die. He just took a time out from life for a few days. He couldn't become our new God if he was dead, right? But to be acknowledged in his role as a redeemer, he had to make the sacrifice. Otherwise the story wouldn't hold. The early Christian leaders sure knew how to have the cake and eat it too. And that is where sin comes in. Without sin, we don't need salvation and have no reason to worship the new God. It isn't there to try to stop the sinners from sinning. It's there so that good people have a reason to believe that they owe their everlasting salvation to the new God while owing their existence to the old God. And even those who haven't committed any sins are still beholden because of original sin. Because Eve disobeyed the old God by eating the apple, and because the sin was passed down from generation to generation, because God decided that it's how it must be. God could have decided to be fair and give everybody a clean slate to begin with, but no. He carefully put a tree in paradise which he didn't have to do. Then he carefully tempted Eve with the forbidden fruit. I don't see how that's Eve's fault, nor even the devil's. If mom deliberately leaves a cookie jar out unsupervised and a child takes one, then she has no one to blame but herself. But spreading blame aside, even if Eve is at fault, what happened to learning the punishment for the crime? Both Adam and Eve were cast out into the wilderness for eating fruit from the forbidden tree. Their descendants, for all eternity, are tainted with this original sin, so that they must come begging for salvation or be doomed to hell for all eternity. All of mankind is sold into servitude for eternity for the price of one stolen fruit. This is not a very balanced reaction. I can imagine a Bronze Age or Dark Ages king killing a subject for eating the king's apple, but not a benevolent God who claims to love us. The concept of sin is a narcissistic trap that leaves the believer with no option but to tread the path to the church's door week in, week out. It isn't about being good and following the rules, because then we would all have been allowed to start our lives innocent, and the punishment would fit the crime. It's about owing something to God, both the old God and the new, whether we have sinned or not. I don't blame God. He doesn't exist. But even if he did, I'm certain he would wash his hands of this nonsense, telling us he gave us a brain and we should have used it. Sin creates a debt in the believer that can only be paid through the church, and in turn its leaders and patrons, forcing believers to bow to their dictates. And even then, they can only ever pay the interest, because the original sin remains. It's the worst kind of gaslighting perpetuated by religion on their followers, so that they can force them into the church and exert power over them. This does nothing to prove that God doesn't exist. But I think I've made my case that the God of the Bible doesn't exist, and that you shouldn't trust the church as far as you can throw it. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, please comment, like, subscribe and share. Until next time.